Oh, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Li, and welcome. Today for Linda's speech. Linda is our senior friend, and she's right now in New York. Next, she will going to introduce you about like how she feels in senior living and how she thinks about the future of senior living. Linda, it's your turn, and take your time.
Okay, I will. And thank you folks for showing up. I am really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you because I'm a senior citizen and I don't get very many chances to talk to people who are not card-carrying Medicare recipients. So when I get to talk to college students, that's a treat. And also because I've taught college students and I happen to like teaching college students. So I'm glad that you invited me today. And I'm also glad that you invited me because I am concerned about the kind of workplace that you folks are going to encounter when you get out into the jobs that you have planned for yourselves. Because what you are going to see in your work is going to be the environment in which I have to live. So that's why I have a stake in this. I'm not just, talking because I didn't have anything else to do. And I'm not really particularly optimistic about what the future is going to be like because it's a really confused picture right at this time. Now, before I go any further, I just want to offer a disclaimer. I'm a senior citizen, but I am not a spokesperson for senior citizens. Senior citizens are age-defined group, but they're not homogeneous. I am not here to say this is what seniors think or what they want or anything like that. I can only give you my impression because my experiences, life experiences, I am reminded when I talk to other people my age, were very different from others people's. When I was a child, I had a lot of health problems and I grew up in a very normal situation. And when I got to be an adult, because of my childhood problems, the kinds of jobs I ended up being able to do were things were short-term and temporary. And they usually, because of the things that I'm good at, they were jobs in either publications or higher ed. And those are what I called my real jobs. Between my real jobs, I took whatever was available to kind of make ends meet. So I worked part-time jobs and temp jobs in things like manufacturing, medicine, engineering, hospitality, financial services. I think just about the only place I didn't work was McDonald's. I missed that one entirely, but I did all kinds of really weird things. And the really weird things that I did are things that made it easy for me to go and do these other kinds of weird things I did, like in publishing and in teaching. I had this incredibly various background, which was really an asset, although I didn't feel like it when I was acquiring my background. So I just want to repeat one more time. My experiences are not typical of seniors of my generation. And so my conclusions may not be typical of people my generation either, but they'll give you something to think about. Now, when I was trying to think about what I was going to say and how to organize it, I found a picture. And this made me laugh. This is the picture of the place that I went to school. from kindergarten up through high school in this building. And it's now a historic site. And I think that's funny. Now, it's not because I went there, it's because it's so old. This was built in 1938. Now, I don't think 1938 is a long time ago, but somebody does. And so this is my historic site. And I'm going to give you a historic presentation. When I saw this, it gave me the idea of how to organize what I wanted to say to you. And basically, I'm going to organize my thoughts in terms of history, 3 historic periods. Okay? And this is what you're going to hear about. I'm going to focus mostly on the post-war baby boom era. This is when I was born. And when most of the things that I see shaping the life of seniors today and what's going to happen in the future for seniors have their birthplace back there in the baby boom era between 45 and 70. We'll go very quickly through some stuff about the Vietnam War era and then come up to what I call the angry era, which we've just gotten through, and we'll get a foot into our current era, which I don't know what we're going to call it, the epidemic era, I guess. This period, the post-war baby boom, that was the time from my childhood up to the time that I got my bachelor's degree in 1970. So that's my early years. During the Vietnam War era, that was my middle adult years. And that basically was when I was toggling together my livelihood from writing and reporting and all those kinds of things, teaching. And I wasn't doing anything else very exciting during those years. The last period, the angry era, is when I turned 50. And from then on, I was doing mostly freelance writing and online teaching for colleges. And this is also when I started going back to doing nursing home visiting, which I had done as a child. That's the overview, what you're going to see and how it's going to chain together. I want to go next to talk about the baby boom era, because I'm a baby boomer. Actually, it's my birthday today. I'm 75. I am definitely baby boomer. And this generation of people my age are having I would say, disproportionate impact on the nursing home, adult home population and what's going on. And the way that we have come by our peculiar perspectives on life, I think it's important for you to understand, because you're going to encounter some of the implications of this as you go into your work. My parents grew up on farms in upstate New York. Neither of my parents finished high school. When they got married, they moved to a ramshackle house on a hillside, and they began to try to make it into a productive farm. When the United States entered World War II, my dad enlisted. My parents closed up the house and the farm. My mother took a job in an airplane factory in the village where I happen to live now, Sydney, New York. And my dad went off to war. In the war, he was in a truck company that carted Chinese products over the mountains from China to India. down the Burma Road. And when the war was over, my parents both went back to the farm. My mother quit her job in the airplane factory. When the war was over, the first thing that people noticed, besides the fact that all these military people came by shiploads full, and there was just this huge influx of men all of a sudden that had been in the war. As they settled in, the first thing we saw with this explosion of population is all these babies are born. I was born in 47, and the baby boom was already well underway by then. When I was in fourth grade in that school that I showed you the picture of, that school was so crowded by the time I was in the fourth grade that they didn't have room enough for all the little kids. So my fourth grade class was held at the American Legion Hall down the street from the school because it just wasn't room enough for them. And that population kept exploding. My sister is just about 9 years younger. If you look really closely at that photograph, you'll see way over on the right is a little bit of a one-story building. That was an addition put on the main building because they had to accommodate all these babies being born during the post-war period. So the babies were one of the big marks of the baby boom era. But another one of the marks of the era, which doesn't get as much publicity today, was that there were a lot of unemployed men. Like my mother, many of the women who were in rural areas moved from farms into either towns or cities to take jobs, war jobs, because men were gone from the jobs. And somebody had to do it, the women took those jobs. When the soldiers came home by the shiploads, they found that the women who before the war hadn't wanted to work, quote unquote, outside their homes, had discovered that working for pay was really more to their liking than being a housewife, which didn't pay all that much. So that was a bit of a problem. The husbands who had been happy that their wives didn't have to stay alone during the war years were not so happy when they realized that their wives didn't want to quit their jobs and come home. So there wasn't much they could do about it either, because by labor law in the United States, the people who had worked during the war years were not allowed to be fired just because somebody who had had the job before the war came back. So there were all these men who had no jobs. The women didn't want to give up their wartime jobs. There weren't enough full-time jobs for the men who had survived the war. And a lot of these women who are my age now worked in the same jobs that they had during the war. They kept those jobs for 20, 30, 40 years until they retired. And that made a very unpleasant environment because men and women were, competing for the same jobs. And it was sometimes a man and a wife competing for the same job. The problem of women taking the jobs of the men who had them before the war was exacerbated by the fact that before the war, there had also been a big influx of immigrants, particularly from those countries that were taken over by Germany and its allies during the war. The immigrants were accepted because there wasn't much competition for the jobs that they went after. They went into usually small town communities, or they did things that the Americans weren't either trained to do or didn't really want to do. When the war was over, the immigrants from before the war couldn't be fired from jobs that they had during the war, just like the women couldn't be fired because of labor law. The men who had had those jobs couldn't be fired. So there were all of these soldiers who had gone out and fought for their country, and they'd come home and had no jobs, and they were not very happy about it. Now, if you were a man, you were somewhat cautious about complaining too loudly about your girlfriend or your wife or your mother taking your job, right? But you could complain about other people, like you could complain about the migrants. And if you are watching TV these days and you see, for example, people in Texas complaining about the immigrants from Mexico or from Peru or somewhere, South America, coming and taking American jobs, part of that is still a hangover from the post-World War II era, when the kids, my generation, heard our parents talking about how the immigrants took our jobs. And that was something we heard, and it still kind of stuck. 70 years later, we still have this mentality there. When the war was over, my dad was tired of taking orders, and he decided to go into business for himself. He wanted to raise chickens. And because it took a while to get the business started, he worked 2 or 3 part-time jobs while he was trying to get the chicken business started. And my mother took care of sizing the eggs and cleaning the chickens and all that stuff. And that was what they did for a number of years. My dad never did make a business of the chicken business, because some other things intervened, and a lot of the farm businesses were not big enough to sustain jobs after the war. Anyway, that's another story. But like my dad, there were thousands of ex-servicemen who couldn't find full-time jobs. And there were so many of them that Congress felt that they had to do something about this. So in 46, the year after the war ended, they passed the GI Bill, which had Congress subsidize college degrees for the servicemen to go back to college to get some jobs, get training for jobs. In 1947, the year I was born, more than 1 million veterans enrolled in college through the GI Bill. It was this big deal. Now, if you're an American-born citizen, I'd be willing to bet a small amount that at least a little bit of the reason that you're attending college is due to expectations set up 75 years ago by the GI Bill. The idea that college is the easiest way to get a good paying job that doesn't require back-breaking work is something that persisted since 1946. It's only been the last couple of years where college-age students in the United States have begun to think again that, oh, maybe I don't need a college degree for every job that I might want to do. Now, just as the women who found jobs during wartime tended to keep them when the men returned, when GIs who had gone to college or done something else after the war, when they found a job, they tended to stick with it for 20, 30, 40 years, however long it takes until retirement. My dad's chicken business never took off, really. I was maybe 7, 8, something like that, when my dad got a full-time job, and he stayed with that employer for 30 years. That was typical. That was the kind of thing that we see today of changing jobs, staying 2 years, 6 years, whatever. It was basically unheard of in the baby boom era. One other consequence of World War II that I want to stress with you is about elder care. Up until World War II, the assumption among Americans was that the family of an older person would take care of them. They would come and live in the household or whatever, and the family would be responsible for elder care. And in pre-war America, 1940 census said 43.5% of the population of the United States was living in rural communities. If you're living in a farming community, rural farming community, or even if just in a rural community where you've got a big yard, you can usually take in an extra person without too much unpleasantness. You find them a bed, and you can take in Uncle Joe, or you can take in Grandma by planting a few more potatoes, and you let the hen hatch the eggs that will grow into chickens for chicken dinner. And it wasn't maybe what people would have wanted, but it worked. It was something that they could do. It didn't upset anybody's plans. The assumption that elder care was the responsibility of the elder's family started to change when the Americans left the farms for towns and cities during World War II. And by the end of the baby boom era, almost 3/4 of the US population lived in urban areas. And with the labor force moving to urban areas and women employed outside the homes, the possibility of families providing elder care became almost impossible. It's when you live in an apartment in the city, it's harder to squeeze in one more person. And it's harder just to feed one more person if you've got to go to the grocery store and pay cash for your purchase rather than planting a few extra potatoes in the field beside the house. It just didn't work that well. So by 1970, when the baby boom era ends, there was a real need for something to replace the elder care that was previously done by relatives. In America's rural towns and villages, there were a few people who looked around them and saw that there was a need, that somebody should be able to take care of these older people. They had the resources and they reached out. And in the baby boom era, toward the end of it, particularly, you saw the emergence of local nursing homes, at least in the rural area. This is where we saw this first. Where I was growing up, near where I went to school, there was a family named Sickmiller, which is a strange name for people who start a nursing home, but they had a farm on the outskirts of the village where I went to school. And they couldn't do much farming during the war because most of the men who were of working age had gone in the service. And the Sickmillers couldn't run their farm by themselves. Mrs. Sickmiller got the idea that she could open up their heads this big rambling farmhouse, porches and all this sort of thing, real country home. And she got the idea that she could open that to older people who didn't have any place to live. She had lots of bedrooms and she could cook. So she opened it up. She called it a nursing home. And what she offered for nursing care probably isn't what we would think of as nursing care at all. She made sure that people kept clean, they had clean clothes to wear, that they had decent meals, that they ate their meals, they got some fresh air, that sort of thing. Her home met a real need for rural people who had no family to take care of them. And it met a real need for the families of some of these people who had moved to more urban areas. When I was a child, my family and another family from our church went one Sunday a month to the Sickmiller nursing home and offered a church service to the people there. And then after the services, we'd go and visit the residents in their rooms. That was my first experience as a nursing home visitor. After we've been going there for several years, another quote unquote nursing home opened near us, different direction. And I almost think that the woman who owned that actually had been a nurse, but she was like Mrs. Sickmiller. She wasn't there to provide medical care so much as she was to make sure that people were clean, they got meals, that they took the pills if the doctor said they had the pills, they got some exercise. She had invited us to come and have a service there because she wanted the residents to see people and people to come in and have some interaction with people in the community. Like Mrs. Sickmiller, that woman was the owner and operator of the building in which she took care of the people. She was the owner, she was the occupant, and she was the operator. And that model is what most of the baby boomers thought of as nursing homes originally. That's where we got our first taste of that. I spent a lot of time on this because I think the baby boom era has so much impressed itself upon the minds of people my age that we basically think about anything to do with aging in terms of what we remember as children. So this is important to how we view the world and what we think our expectations are. Okay, next step, Vietnam War era. We won't take much time on that. This one is much. In 1970, America was very different than it was in 1945. The kids who were born during the Vietnam era tended to grow up in more urban areas. They were not New York City necessarily types, but not the hometowns with, the one market and one gas station. They were bigger places where people actually went to shop, and you could buy things at a store. The people in the Vietnam era tended to have two-income homes. The baby boomers' parents usually both worked outside their homes. Baby boomer parents, partially because of the way they had to work, and I think partially because of the fact that they were still working full-time jobs as adults, both parents, they didn't really expect their kids to, do much work outside the house, to do chores, and then even pay much attention to whether the kids did their homework, I don't think. The Vietnam era kids had less supervision and less discipline than the baby boomers. And they grew up thinking that they would go to college, they'd get a good job, they'd make lots of money. And they thought that because college had been the way for their fathers to be rescued from the post-war unemployment. And when the Vietnam era kids left for college, their parents said, go ahead, you've got your own life to lead, let the kids off. And because the kids were going to cities, that was the ideal then, the phenomena, I guess, in my viewpoint as a baby boomer, was that the parents would be on the East Coast and the children would be on the West Coast. It wasn't like families used to be in the baby boom era when everybody in the family was within 10-mile radius of each other. This was separated, and in this kind of environment, there was a drop in any families who could care for the family's elders. It was just almost going to be impossible. So in the Vietnam era, the number of nursing homes grew and their character changed. The home aspect of a nursing home became secondary to the nursing aspect. And instead of the homes being owner-operated and owner-occupied, the nursing homes just became owner-operated. And then gradually the owner didn't live on the premises, the owner lived someplace else. And then gradually the owner hired somebody to manage the nursing home. And so the home aspect sort of disappeared by the end of the Vietnam era. By the end of 1995, we find that nursing homes are pretty much run by companies rather than by individuals. And that changes everything about the institution. One other thing I think is true of the Vietnam era, and that is that people in the Vietnam era somehow began to think that nursing homes were places that old people went to live until they died, that was what their function was. And I think that people were still believing that in 1995. But the people who owned the nursing homes in 1995 weren't thinking that way anymore. They had begun to realize that if they had to care for an old person for 20 or 30 or 40 years, they weren't going to make any money off of it. It was not going to be profitable enough for them. So there's this difference, I guess, between how the operator sees the business and how the customer sees the business. Which brings us up to the more recent era. I call this the angry era because it was marked by such things as the bombing of the Twin Towers and America's response to that. It saw the election, the presidency of Donald Trump, who might have be said to have made anger his platform. But even though those are the most dramatic events, I think, of this 25-year period, they're not what really defines it. What really defines this era was that the people born in 1935, who lived through the Second World War, turned 65 in 2000, and they qualified for Social Security. That means that ever since that date, a big chunk of working Americans' tax dollars have gone to support the country's senior citizens. Okay. Both the baby boomers and the adults of the Vietnam era were angry in 2020, and their anger hasn't diminished since. The baby boomers, like me, were more or less expecting that Social Security was going to support them. And we're finding out that Social Security does not support them as well as we had kind of expected it was going to. And my generation is angry about that. But the Vietnam era babies, who are now working adults, are realizing that there's probably not going to be any Social Security funds left when they're ready to retire. And they're angry about that. Now, I have a certain amount of sympathy for both those opinions. And if you, somewhat younger than I am, feel that, let's say I collected Social Security the last 10 years. So, if you thought that all you got out of my collecting Social Security for 10 years is this crappy PowerPoint presentation, you might not feel very happy about that, right? I think there are a lot of people who are the younger generation, the upcoming generation, the last of the angry era and the beginning of the epidemic era, who have real reason to be angry and who are going to be stuck with making some really hard choices about things that we don't even know are choices yet. Which brings me up to here, where we are. What's going to happen next? We know what we've got now is the epidemic. That's top of everybody's mind. But what's going to happen next? I don't know. But I can make a few guesses. Long before COVID emerged, nursing home operators, which are now typically for-profit organizations, corporations, realized they couldn't afford to care for residents until those residents died, unless they curtailed their own profits. It was too expensive to care for somebody from age 65 until 95 or 100. They couldn't do that. Now, some people, maybe we're among them, would say nursing home profits are excessive. But that doesn't change the fact that none but the richest Americans who are 68 years old today are going to be able to afford nursing care in the future because there's not going to be money to pay for it. It's just not going to happen. the not only is that business model untenable, but nursing homes are also causing or getting in a lot of trouble, because when the epidemic started, it was clear that they were not prepared for an epidemic. And the medical community has known for years an epidemic was coming. They know now that other epidemics are coming, and nursing homes were not prepared to cope with it. What's going to happen? I don't know for sure, but I know pretty much we're going to have some kind of a backlash. There's a lot of resentment. Staffing is inadequate. Nursing homes, even the best of them, are having trouble keeping people. There's just doesn't seem to be enough money or staff or anything to go around. And it's anybody's guess, I think, what's going to happen. A lot of people making predictions. One of the things that I think we're going to see is that the big chains are going to recreate themselves to be retirement communities for the super wealthy. That's going to be an exclusive conclave for them. And there are a lot of people that predict it, and I wouldn't be surprised if that would happen, because that's where the money is. You go where the money is. But if those big chains reinvent themselves, that's going to leave us with some problems. One of the problems is that you're going to have all these non-wealthy ex-nursing home residents. Where are you going to put them? Where are they going to go? If they can't go in with their families, what's going to happen to them? There has to be some alternative. Actually, there have to be many alternatives, I think, a variety of them. But that's going to be a big problem. And there's a second problem that nobody ever talks about. But if you've ever had anything to do with the closure of a public facility or a large private facility, you know that what happens when something closes down is that it tends, if it's not immediately taken over into a new format, new life, it tends to disintegrate. And some of these things turn into slums. That's truth of what happens. Like in cities, particularly, you notice it. Something was built for a public purpose. It doesn't serve it well. And before you know it, the people that come in it have created a slum. So one of our problems is going to be, how do you create something from the nursing homes if you abandon them for nursing home facilities? How do you keep them from becoming another drag on society? I don't know. Whatever happens, I am going to say a couple of things that I can suggest that are not going to solve the world's problems, but maybe solve a tiny bit of the world's problems. I'm going to suggest that people who are interested in what happens with senior citizens, and more personally, what happens to them, I think, as well, is that you need to think about doing some stuff with senior citizens. One thing, if it's all possible, you should drop in to see your own family members as regularly as you can. And I use the term drop by because when I was growing up, kids my age, women my age, all remember that we had, there was always somebody in the family you had to go visit. And whoever it was that you had to go visit was somebody, either your mother or your father or somebody you didn't like. And it was always an unpleasant time. And it was the whole word visit to women of my generation has this very negative connotation. We women use the term drop by. That meant you went to see somebody that you wanted to see. And even if you only had 5 minutes, it was worth it to spend 5 minutes with that person. That was what men of our generation who are sensitive to the word visit, they don't drop by usually. They stop in. They stop into the hardware store, or they stop in to see their brother-in-law, or those are the kinds they do. It's the idea of you going to spend some time with somebody that you want to spend time with for whatever reason. And I'm suggesting to you, especially if you don't have family close by, that you try to find some elderly persons nearby that you can drop in on, that you can make a friend of. If there's nobody right handy, you might try doing nursing home visiting. That's what I did my last nursing home visiting. I took a dog to be the pet visitor because this nice elderly lady who lived down the street that I became acquainted with, her daughter was the activities director at the nursing home. She thought my dog was a very nice dog and that he would like to visit in the nursing home. So I agreed. I took the dog to be the pet visitor, and I went alone and held the leash. And I did that for many years. And some of my best friends were in the nursing home. They were wonderful people, had marvelous stories to tell. And I have been reading in some of the research I'm doing for the books I'm writing about nursing home visiting, that there are many people in nursing homes who don't get even one visit from anybody in a month. And one of the things we know because of the epidemic, it's kind of top of mind, is that nursing homes need to be a place where you have socialization. If you just keep everybody in their room, it's like, you can imagine if you were college and they locked you in your room and you didn't see anybody, for a week at a time, what it would do to you. Well, it doesn't do any good for seniors either. So that's something that I think is a doable thing. One other thing that I suggest is what I call paying forward, where you try to do for a friend's parent something you can't do for your own. This idea came to me because the elderly couple who lived across the street from me here in town, and they were very nice people. I liked them a lot. And their daughter came to visit from California. And one day she was out for taking her morning run, and she stopped over in my yard. We talked, and she said to me, I just am so amazed. My mother listens to you. She said, I try to talk to my mother to tell her something, and she won't pay a bit of attention to me. And she said, you can tell her all these things I can't talk to her about. And I said, I can't talk to my mother either. For the same reason. She's my mother. She's not going to take advice from her kid. This is not what mothers do, right? You go back to California and find one of your girlfriends who is having trouble talking to her mother. You become a friend of the mother, and you can do for her mother what you can't do for yours. because of the parent-child relationship. That's something you can do. And finally, when you hear good stories, elderly people have all kinds of stories. I love to pick up the stories from the people in the nursing homes. They're wonderful things. And they're great if you can share them. And particularly, this is one of my little tricks, I guess, is when I tell a story, I never say I got this from somebody who's senior in resident in the nursing home. I always say, a friend of mine that I visit in the nursing home, making the friend part the important part. Where my friend lives is immaterial. But the friend, if the person you share from is a friend, that elevates that above something that was just your duty to do. Okay. That's all that I have to share with you, and I talk too much anyway. I hope that gives you something to think about. I know it's not going to solve the problems of the world. It just won't. But what you can do one-on-one is probably more important than what you can do one on 1,000. Okay. Okay, back to you. Let's have questions, comments, whatever.
Yeah, I saw Bright just coming in, and welcome. And we will have recordings if you miss the formal part. Don't worry about that. And I saw Marika's comment there. The pandemic really shed light on many issues for different things, but especially for healthcare and nursing homes. I guess, Lena, you mentioned that during your speech, and Marika also commented that she feel that she always tried to remind her mom that she's the future dermatologist to justify the talking about these things. I feel the same. I always like talk with my parents, even we're just chatting online. I told them, okay, doing exercise every day, be careful on the food you're eating, but they are just, I don't care about that. So Linda, how do you comment on that? As a seniors, take advice from the younger generation, or how you evaluate their suggestions?
How would I, as a senior, evaluate something from the younger generation?
Yes.
I'm not sure that I know how I do that well. I think I'd have to put myself in the position, like when I was a teacher and I was dealing with freshman college students who have questions and so forth. I think you try to put yourself in that person's place, understand where they're coming from, and then say, is there something about my experience that makes me able to understand it from their perspective? Or does my experience say, I can't understand it from their perspective? And I don't think you can I don't think I can answer that question honestly without being in a situation where somebody asked me a question that I had to, come up with an answer for. I think sometimes the younger generation has better ideas because they don't have the baggage of the past. Sometimes they have worse ideas because they haven't had the experience of the past. So you try to balance that. And it's on a case by case basis. And that's best I can make up for you.
Okay.
And
yeah, much appreciated about your conversation and your answers. Guys, if you have any questions, just unmute yourself. You don't need to open your camera, but just yell out. We will take like 2 more minutes to stay here, and it probably be nearly to 9 p.m. in New York right now. So we do not want to make Linda stay for longer, and that might be affect her sleep.
Okay. But if anybody wants to yell at me something, you can give them my email address. They can send me an email, ask me questions, whatever. You know, I'm sort of here. So whatever works. Yeah.
Right, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry for coming in late. I was finishing up in my internship, but I, looked through your slides ahead of time and checked out your LinkedIn. And one thing I'm curious about, just from what you said recently about using the word friend and sort of thinking of that as a way to treat someone as an equal or a peer, I'm wondering, something that happens to me is when people refer to older adults as cute, it really irks me. And I'm just wondering if that irks you and if there's any response that you have to that, because I don't want to shame people and have that backfire, but I would love to have some kind of helpful retort.
Well, I would too. There's a nice assistant and aide here who I like very much, and she does a really great job. But when she calls me honey, I would just like hit her over the head, And I can't. I mean, I can't say anything to her because she's such a sweetheart. I think there's sometimes you just sort of let it go.
Mm-hmm.
If it's someone that you're close enough to that you pick your time, you can say, I wonder if it might be better if you phrased it this way. Yeah. But yeah, you have to be real sensitive to that, and it may not work real well. So.
True.
But
yeah.
I really understand what you're talking about. But yeah.
You don't want to shut anybody down, but I just noticed, with the best meaning people and even people in this program, that it just can come out as so like diminutive and condescending.
It does. And I think one of the ways that you can counter it a bit is by saying, if you're dealing with an older person, say, how would you like me to address you? Do you want me to call you Mrs. So-and-so, or do you want me to call you, sometimes there are people that I've known for years and years and years and never called by their first name, ever. I mean, and the person wasn't that much older than me. And then there are other people, I'll tell you a story. I met a woman who happened to go to the same church, and she told me this one day. She's about 20 years older than I was. She told me that she had tried to make a friend of the pastor's wife, because she said usually the pastor's wife doesn't really have any friends because she can't be friends with people in the congregation, blah, blah, blah. And so this woman said she was that much older and she had no family really. And so she was trying to be a friend to this pastor's wife. And the pastor's wife did not reciprocate. And so I was sitting there and heard her tell this story. And I said to her, okay, you want a friend? I am going to be your friend. And I am not going to call you Mrs. Hornbeck. I am not even going to call you Frederica. I am going to call you Freddie. And I am going to pretend that we have been friends since second grade. And so she said, okay. That's what we did. We were friends. We talked like we had been to second grade. And, that was how our relationship was. She wanted a friend. Okay, so I was a friend.
Mm-hmm.
So you can do that too. You find the right person, but you kind of got to pick your fight, I guess.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? That was an interesting one.
Okay, thank you, Brad, and really interesting questions. And I have posted Linda's email address and her LinkedIn in the chatting box in case if you want to contact her and talk with her about like more interesting things you are look for. And if there's no any other questions, we just end up here today. Many thanks. Yeah, many thanks, Linda, and happy birthday. And
well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, today
it's been fun. I miss my college students.
Yeah, here's all your college.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night here. Good night to you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, you can just exist and then that's it.
That's it.
Yeah. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will email you later.
Okay, good. Bye-bye. Give me